I sacrificed everything for her, but what she did on my birthday will shock you. This is my story. I've always been someone who thrives in social situations. Whether it's cracking a joke at the right moment or striking up a conversation with a stranger, I've never struggled to make connections. Especially with women. For me, flirting wasn't just a skill, it was fun. I loved the thrill of it, the playful exchanges, and the way a single laugh could turn a bad day into something better. Then I met her. From the moment we crossed paths, something shifted in me. She wasn't like anyone else I'd ever met. She had this effortless charm about her, a spark that made it impossible to look away. At 22, she seemed like the kind of person who could walk into a room and light it up without even trying. I'm 30, and I thought I'd seen it all by now. I'd dated, I'd been in relationships, and I thought I understood the game. But with her, I felt like a rookie again, completely out of my depth. It all started innocently enough. We began texting, and for the first time in years, I found myself excited every time my phone buzzed. She was quick-witted, funny, and full of life. Our conversations were so easy, like we'd known each other forever. I started going out of my way to make her smile, planning little surprises that I knew would catch her off guard. I wanted to stand out, to show her I wasn't like the other guys vying for her attention. And when I saw her face light up, her eyes sparkling with that unmistakable glow of happiness, I felt like I'd done something right. But as perfect as it seemed, there was always a distance between us. A barrier I couldn't quite break through. No matter how much effort I put in, she always held me at arm's length. It wasn't blatant, but it was there, subtle and unspoken. I tried playing it cool, giving her space to see if she'd close the gap on her own. I'd go a day or two without texting her, just to see if she'd reach out. Sometimes she would, but her responses were so unpredictable. One day she'd be warm and attentive, texting me like I was the most important person in her world. The next, her replies were curt and distant, like she couldn't be bothered. It was like chasing the wind, always there but never within reach. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she needed time to open up. After all, we hadn't been talking for long. It had only been 2 weeks since we'd started texting, but in those 2 weeks, I'd poured so much of myself into getting to know her. She was always polite but firm whenever I suggested meeting up. There was always some excuse, a busy schedule, plans she couldn't cancel, or simply that she wasn't in the mood to go out. Still, I didn't want to give up. I started thinking outside the box, coming up with ways to make her notice me without coming on too strong. Romantic gestures that weren't overbearing but thoughtful enough to make her feel special. I'd leave small gifts for her, write notes that hinted at my feelings without being too direct. And even though she'd brush them off, claiming she wasn't into that kind of thing, her eyes told a different story. Every time, without fail, they'd light up, betraying her words. She wasn't seeing anyone at the time, or at least that's what she told me. And I believed her. I'd never been one to doubt people without reason, and she hadn't given me any. All I knew was that I wanted to be the one to make her smile, the one she thought of before falling asleep. But just as I thought I was making progress, she dropped a bombshell. One evening, she casually mentioned she'd be leaving for another city. It was for work, she said, just a quick trip, nothing major. I asked if she'd be going alone, and she hesitated before giving me a vague answer. "It's just a colleague," she said, brushing it off like it wasn't worth discussing. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. I didn't want to seem insecure or controlling, especially not so early on. Little did I know, that trip would change everything. After she left for her trip, something shifted. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Long-distance communication can be tricky, and I figured she was just busy. But the way she texted me started to change. Her messages became shorter, less frequent. Where we once joked and shared every little detail about our days, now her replies felt obligatory, like she was checking a box rather than genuinely engaging. I told myself not to overthink it. People get busy, right? But the doubt lingered, creeping into the back of my mind like an unwelcome guest. When she finally returned, I was eager to see her. I offered to take her out to celebrate her homecoming, thinking a nice dinner would bring us back to where we'd left off. But she declined, saying she was exhausted from the trip and needed time to recover. Fair enough, I thought. Traveling can be draining. But days passed, and she still didn't seem interested in meeting up. Instead, she kept our interactions confined to texts, and even those felt off. There was an emotional distance now, one I couldn't ignore. The warm, engaging woman I'd been so drawn to seemed to be slipping away, leaving behind someone colder, more guarded. Then, a small detail slipped out, something she probably didn't mean for me to notice. While casually recounting her trip, she mentioned the colleague she'd traveled with. Her words were vague, but they raised questions I didn't want to ask. It wasn't a big deal, she'd said, brushing over the subject as quickly as possible. Who was this colleague? Why hadn't she mentioned him before? And why did it feel like she was trying to downplay something important? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I let it go, for the moment. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, I didn't give up. I doubled down on my efforts, trying to rekindle the connection we'd had before she left. I surprised her at her workplace with coffee and pastries one morning, hoping to brighten her day. She smiled, thanked me, and said all the right things, but the spark wasn't there. I started to wonder if I'd misread everything. Had I imagined the connection between us? Was I the only one putting in the effort? And yet, every time I thought about walking away, I'd remember those moments when her eyes lit up. I'd replayed the times we'd laughed together, the little signs of affection she'd shown. Surely, those things weren't fake. But as much as I wanted to believe in what we had, her actions kept telling a different story. She became harder to reach, often taking hours to respond to my messages, or not replying at all. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd assure me it was, but her tone was dismissive, almost annoyed. I felt like I was intruding just by wanting to talk to her. It was around this time that I started noticing her mood swings. One day, she'd be sweet and attentive, texting me good morning and asking about my plans. The next, she'd barely acknowledge me, her responses short and indifferent. I tried to brush it off as stress or a bad day, but the inconsistency was maddening. I started second-guessing myself, analyzing every conversation, every gesture. Was I being too much? Not enough? I'd always been confident in my ability to read people, but with her, I felt lost. And then there was the moment that sent my doubts into overdrive. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a photo she'd been tagged in. It was a group picture, her, a couple of coworkers, and a man I didn't recognize. They were all smiling, arms casually draped around each other's shoulders. But the way she was leaning into him, it was subtle, but it didn't sit right with me. I wanted to ask her about it, but what could I say? It wasn't like she'd done anything wrong. Still, the image stuck with me, gnawing at my confidence. For the first time, I started to wonder if I was the only one investing in this relationship. By now, my efforts to win her over felt less like a romantic pursuit and more like a desperate attempt to prove myself. I wanted her to see me, to acknowledge what I was bringing to the table. But the harder I tried, the more it felt like I was chasing something that wasn't there. And yet I couldn't let go. Looking back now, I don't know how I missed it. The signs were there all along, clear as day, but I was too caught up in the thrill of being with her to notice. It's embarrassing to admit, but I was buying her love, and I didn't even realize it at the time. After she got back from her trip, things between us shifted. At first, I thought it was my persistence finally paying off. She seemed more receptive, smiling more when I was around and even agreeing to see me more often. It felt like I was breaking through that wall she'd put up, and I was ecstatic. But looking back, I see it for what it was. It wasn't my charm or personality that won her over, it was my wallet. It started small. She'd casually mention things she liked, almost in passing. A pair of designer sunglasses she'd been eyeing. A trendy restaurant she'd been dying to try. She never outright asked me for anything, but there was always this expectation hanging in the air, like she was testing to see how far I'd go. And I went far. Too far. I'd take her out to the places she hinted at, buy her the things she mentioned, all while convincing myself that I was just being a good boyfriend. But deep down, there was this nagging voice in my head, telling me that this wasn't normal. That it wasn't healthy to feel like I had to spend money to earn her affection. But every time I started to question it, she'd reel me back in. She had a way of making me feel like the most important person in the world, when it suited her. She'd laugh at my jokes, hold my hand in public, even post pictures of us together on social media with captions like, "Lucky girl." And for a while, I let myself believe it. But her affection always seemed tied to what I could do for her. One night, we were out to dinner at this upscale place she'd been raving about. As we sat there, sipping overpriced cocktails and eating a meal which cost 3 times more than an average restaurant dinner, she started talking about her future. She had big dreams, traveling the world, living in a penthouse, owning a closet full of designer clothes. "I just want someone who can keep up with me," she said, twirling her wine glass and looking at me with those mesmerizing eyes of hers. "Someone who knows how to treat a woman right." I knew what she meant. And I knew exactly what she was doing. Still, I smiled and nodded, pretending I didn't feel the weight of her expectations pressing down on me. The changes in her behavior were subtle at first. She had this uncanny ability to make me feel like every choice I made to impress her was my own idea. It was a kind of manipulation so smooth that I didn't even see it for what it was until much later. I was completely hooked on the idea of keeping her happy, of proving that I was the kind of guy who could give her the life she wanted. She'd talk about her dreams constantly, of living in a beautiful house with an ocean view, traveling to exotic places, wearing the kind of clothes you only see on runways. And every time she shared one of these fantasies, she'd glance at me with this look, as if to say, "Are you the man who can give me this?" Her comments were never direct, but they didn't need to be. She'd say things like, "It's rare to find someone who can match my energy. Some guys just don't get it." Or, "I think a woman should feel cherished, don't you?" She said it with such conviction that I found myself nodding along, convinced that she was absolutely right. One moment stands out in particular. We were walking past a boutique with these huge glass windows displaying designer handbags and shoes. She stopped mid-step and stared at one of the bags like it was the Holy Grail. "I've always wanted something like that," she said, her voice soft, almost dreamy. Then she turned to me with that playful smile that could disarm anyone and added, "But I guess it's not for everyone. Only certain women are lucky enough to have someone who sees their worth." I didn't say anything, but the message was loud and clear. A week later, that bag was sitting on her arm, and she looked radiant. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and said, "You really do understand me." For a brief moment, I felt like I'd won her over, like I was finally breaking through to her. But that moment didn't last. She didn't suddenly become more affectionate or invested in us. If anything, she seemed even more distracted. Her phone was always buzzing with messages, and she'd smile at the screen in a way that made my chest tighten. When I asked who it was, she'd laugh and say, "Just the girls. Don't be so jealous." Her nights out became more frequent. Parties, dinners, happy hours. It was like she had a never-ending calendar of events. And I was never invited. "You wouldn't enjoy it," she'd tell me with a wave of her hand. Or worse, "It's just a girl's thing. Don't overthink it." I didn't overthink it, I obsessed over it. The more distant she became, the harder I worked to win her back. I started buying her things she didn't even ask for. Shoes she'd admired in passing, tickets to shows she mentioned liking, even jewelry that I thought would remind her of me when she wore it. She always accepted these gifts with a smile, but there was something hollow about her gratitude. She didn't light up the way she used to. She didn't gush or tell me how thoughtful I was. She'd just say, "Thanks, babe," before moving on to whatever was next on her agenda. Then came the night she stopped pretending. We were sitting on her couch, her scrolling through Instagram while I tried to make conversation. Out of nowhere, she put her phone down and looked at me with this strange mix of seriousness and amusement. You know, Vanessa's boyfriend just bought her a car, she said, tilting her head slightly, like she was testing the waters. I laughed, assuming she was joking. Good for Vanessa, I said, trying to keep things light. But she didn't laugh. I'm serious, she said, leaning forward. Don't you think it's romantic when a guy does something like that? It's such a big gesture. It shows how much he cares. There was a moment of silence where I didn't know how to respond. Then she added, almost casually, I mean, I'm not saying you have to. But it's the kind of thing that makes a woman feel valued, you know? I could feel the tension building in the room, thick and heavy like a storm cloud. She wasn't asking me to buy her a car. She was telling me that if I didn't, someone else might. Look, she continued, her tone soft but deliberate. I love that you do little things for me. But sometimes, a woman like me needs more. I need to know that the person I'm with sees me as an equal, someone worth investing in. I should have walked away right then and there. I should have seen it for the manipulation it was. But instead, I nodded like an idiot, promising her I'd think about it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She was back on her phone, scrolling through photos of luxury cars and laughing at memes while I sat there, spiraling. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said, how she'd framed it in a way that made me feel like less of a man for even hesitating. By the time I left that night, I'd already made up my mind. I picked up extra shifts at work, took on freelance gigs, and started cutting corners wherever I could. I told myself it was worth it, that she was worth it. But deep down, a part of me knew this wasn't love. This was a transaction, plain and simple. And I was footing the bill. At first, everything seemed perfect. I won her over. I worked hard, put in the effort, and it paid off. Expensive dinners, surprise gifts, a spontaneous weekend trip. It was like I'd cracked the code to her heart. When I finally asked her to make things official between us, she smiled, and for the first time, I felt like she was truly mine. But relationships built on shaky foundations tend to crumble, don't they? It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. After a couple of months together, my financial cushion began to thin. Between the lavish dates and the little surprises I kept showering her with, I was spending way more than I could afford. I knew I needed to rein it in, but how could I? Every time she mentioned wanting something, a designer bag, a new gadget, tickets to an exclusive event, I felt this gnawing pressure to make it happen. I wanted to keep her happy, to prove I could be the guy she deserved. Eventually, the financial strain caught up with me. One of my side gigs fell through, and suddenly, I wasn't just running out of money, I was running out of options. I had to take on a second job, working nights, just to stay afloat. At first, I thought she'd understand. But the moment I stopped spoiling her, something shifted. She became distant again. It wasn't immediate or obvious, but I noticed it. She stopped asking about my day, stopped texting me as often. And when we were together, she was glued to her phone. Sometimes she'd laugh at something on her screen, then quickly put it away when I asked what was so funny. I convinced myself I was overthinking. I mean, she was still there, wasn't she? She still kissed me goodnight and told me she loved me. That had to mean something. But then came the whispers of doubt I couldn't ignore. One night, I overheard her on the phone. She was in the bedroom, talking softly. I caught phrases like, "No, he's at work," and "I don't think he suspects anything." My stomach twisted into knots, but I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a friend, a cousin, anyone but what I feared. Still, I started noticing more red flags. She'd come home late from work, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. Her excuses were vague, her explanations riddled with holes. Once, I found a receipt for a dinner at a fancy restaurant, one we hadn't gone to together. I should have confronted her, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of the truth. Or maybe I was too wrapped up in trying to salvage what we had. That's when I made the worst decision of my life. Desperate to prove my worth, I took out a loan. A big one. I used it to buy her something she'd been dreaming about for months, a luxury car. When I handed her the keys, she threw her arms around me, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. For a moment, I felt like the hero again, like I'd finally done something right. But the feeling didn't last. Even with the car parked in our driveway, her behavior didn't change. If anything, it got worse. She started disappearing for hours at a time. Sometimes I'd call her, and she wouldn't pick up. Other times, she'd answer with a clipped, impatient tone, saying she was busy and couldn't talk. The worst part? She never even tried to hide it. One night, she came home with a smudge of lipstick on her collar, lipstick that wasn't her shade. I pointed it out, half joking, hoping she'd laugh it off and give me some plausible explanation. Instead, she just shrugged and said, "Oh, it must have rubbed off from one of the girls at work." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But deep down I knew. I was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, drowning in debt, and she was slipping through my fingers. The harder I tried to hold on, the more distant she became. I started obsessing over every little thing, her texts, her body language, the way she avoided looking me in the eye when I asked how her day went. And then there were the nights when she didn't come home at all. She'd always have an excuse. A last-minute work meeting. A girls' night out that ran late. I pretended to accept it, but inside, I was unraveling. I felt like a fool, like the punchline of a cruel joke I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I kept hoping that if I just worked a little harder, gave a little more, she'd see how much I loved her. That she'd come back to me. But the truth was staring me in the face. She already had 1 foot out the door. I'll never forget that night, my birthday, of all days. I'd been working a brutal night shift, the kind that leaves you running on fumes and wondering why you're even doing it in the first place. But as I clocked out and walked to my car, all I could think about was getting home to her. Despite everything, I still hoped she'd remember. Maybe she'd planned a surprise or at least waited up to wish me a happy birthday in person. I told myself that this time would be different, that she'd finally show me she cared. But when I opened the door to our house, I knew something was wrong. The lights were dim, and there was this faint hum of music coming from the living room. For a second, I thought maybe she had planned something after all. My heart lifted just a little as I set my keys down and stepped inside. Then I heard it. Laughter, hers, light and carefree, the way she used to laugh with me. And a man's voice, deep and familiar in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe it was a friend or a coworker, someone harmless. But when I turned the corner and saw them, all the lies I'd been telling myself came crashing down. There she was, curled up on the couch with him, her hands on his shoulders, his lips on hers. The same couch where we used to sit, where I'd held her close and thought I was building a life with her. My first instinct was to yell, to demand answers, to let all the anger and hurt pour out of me. But instead I just stood there, frozen, as the weight of everything I'd done for her came flooding back. The loan I'd taken out to buy her that damn car. The endless hours I'd worked, sacrificing my sleep and sanity to keep her happy. The countless gifts, the dinners, the trips, all of it flashing through my mind like a cruel highlight reel. And for what? She didn't love me. She never had. I could see it in the way she looked at him, so effortless, so genuine. It was the look I'd been chasing for months but had never truly earned. She noticed me then, her eyes widening in shock as she jumped up from the couch. "Wait, it's not what you think," she said, but her voice was hollow, like even she didn't believe her own words. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my chest felt like it was going to cave in. I just turned around, walked to the counter, and grabbed the spare keys to the car I'd bought her. "What are you doing?" she called after me, but I didn't stop. I got into that car, the one I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for, the one she'd demanded as proof of my love, and drove. My hands were shaking, my vision blurry with a mix of rage and tears, but I didn't care. I drove until I reached the lake on the edge of town, the one where we'd once shared a picnic and talked about dreams that were never meant to be. Without thinking, I got out, left the engine running, and pushed the car toward the water. It wasn't easy, but adrenaline has a way of making impossible things happen. I watched as the front wheels rolled in, the headlights cutting through the dark water like two empty eyes staring back at me. And then, with a final lurch, it was gone. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the water settle, feeling the cold wind bite at my skin. It should have felt like revenge, like I'd taken back some of the power she'd stolen from me. But all I felt was empty. I didn't go home after that. I couldn't. Instead, I called a cab to my friend Brian's house and knocked on the door. When he opened it, I didn't say a word. I just walked inside, grabbed a bottle of whiskey from his counter, and started drinking. I had no money, so Brian paid for the taxi. Brian didn't ask questions. He sat with me in silence, pouring glass after glass until I couldn't think straight anymore. By the time I woke up, it was already late in the evening, 8:46 p.m. on December 4th, 2024. My head was pounding, my throat dry, and my chest heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I looked at my phone, saw a couple of missed calls from her, and threw it across the room. She didn't matter anymore. But as I sat there, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, the questions I'd been avoiding all night finally hit me. Did she ever love me? Or was I just a means to an end, a way to get the things she wanted without having to work for them? And more than that, would I ever be able to believe in love again? Because right now, it felt like a cruel joke, a lie people tell themselves to justify the pain and sacrifice that comes with it. I thought about everything I'd done, every choice I'd made to try and keep her happy. The loan, the 2 jobs, the sleepless nights, the endless gifts, it all seemed so foolish now. How could I have been so blind? So desperate? But the worst part wasn't losing her. It was losing myself in the process. As I sat there, staring at the empty glass in my hand, I realized that I wasn't just mourning the end of a relationship. I was mourning the part of me that had believed in something better, in the idea that love could be selfless and pure. And now I'm writing this, all of it, because I need to make sense of what happened. To remind myself of what I've been through and, maybe, to warn someone else before they make the same mistakes I did. If you're reading this, take it from me, love isn't something you should have to buy. And if someone makes you feel like it is, they don't deserve your heart, or your time. I kindly ask you to publish my story. I would also really like to ask the subscribers to share their advice on what I should do. I need an objective perspective from the outside. Thank you, and peace to all.